Hey, well, mate, what's the weather like in Cairns, brother? Are you in Cairns?
No, I'm in Sydney today. Not too bad, not too bad at all. Clear skies, but spewing I can't be there in person. I love Darwin with all my heart, and the few times that I've been there, and I just want to extend my thanks for the offer and apologies for not being able to be there in person. But again, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for offering. Quick, did you get to hear what Paul said, mate?
Yeah, I did hear what Paul said, and there are a couple of things that stood out. One is, yeah, the conflict is a very real thing. Some might say in conservation it kind of comes with the territory a little bit, but doesn't matter where you're from, having these robust discussions and working on evidence-based solutions and taking into account, you know, people's connection to place, whether it's a business or where they've grown up, you really can come to positive solutions that have a brighter future for everyone. And I agree with Paul, particularly in the case of Queensland and the net fisheries. The history there of not making firm decisions when they're required, with the future in mind, and that whittling down approach and the bit by bit, and it can be quite damaging because when you do have to make the hard decisions down the track, like Queensland has done, those decisions inevitably come a lot more difficult. But Queensland has seen the writing on the wall and have made those decisions. And as we're discussing today with the Northern Territory, there is that opportunity to make these decisions to really bolster the territory waters and retain that place that's so famous across the world. And I'm happy to get into a few reasons as to why that's the case, aside from it just being a barra capital. It's quite famous for other reasons too.
Good, mate. I must apologise. I forgot to formally introduce you, my friend, but you're a marine biologist. You appreciate the power of science, communication, and community, and you have a PhD. My piece of paper is written. What is the PhD in? Sorry.
I studied how sharks and rays get stressed out in commercial fisheries and what that means for their survival, populations, and reproduction. So I know for a few of the fishers in there, the relationship with sharks as the tax man can be a bit fraught at times. But again, it's all about with how we interact with the environment and making sure we're all responsible in our actions, so that whether you're a pro fisher, a rec fisher, mum and dad going for a snorkel, however which way, we can all enjoy a really healthy environment that brings, at the end of the day, really money to communities.
So just to tell us the impact of gill nets. I guess we really don't know. It's kind of a loaded question. We've all got our thoughts, and we've seen, images on the internet with things. What's the impact? Give it to us right between the eyes.
Right between the eyes. So gill nets, for those who aren't aware, are basically giant fishing nets. They're invisible when they're in the water, and they're not selective at all in terms of the range of animals that they catch. And so with respect to Queensland and the territory, the impacts on endangered species are largely the same. So we're looking at, in terms of my expertise, sawfish, critically endangered sawfish. We're looking at endangered river sharks. We're looking at turtles, dolphins, dugongs, all getting snared in the nets. And the numbers that come through generally are quite underreported. So to use Queensland as an example, as Paul's touched on from where they've come from, underreporting was occurring in the hundreds to the thousands each year in individual animals. With particular turtles, was in the thousands as an estimate. Sawfish, there's 4 of the world's 5 species in Australian waters and in territory waters, but on Queensland, with the exception of the narrow sawfish and a little bit of the green and other species, they've largely been wiped out from the east coast because of commercial fishing, and again, largely gill nets. We've seen hammerhead sharks, endangered hammerhead sharks, dumped in the thousands in the Great Barrier Reef. And what this points to is that gill netting, quite literally, is a catch-all way of fishing. And if it's not managed really, really, really closely and effectively, it can weaken food chains. So when you're taking out too many sharks and rays, for example, who are typically at the top of a food chain, those food chains can become unbalanced and potentially collapse. And what this then means is you've also got reduced resilience in the environment. So when we look at the reef, and again, this is why there was such a big push to get gill nets out, is you're reducing the reef's overall resilience. So when bleaching comes through, these animals are not only stressed in terms of low population numbers, but they're just going to find it even harder and harder to bounce back. So that's, I suppose, from an endangered species and an environmental point of view. But the other big kicker is the really huge negative social license that you get. So you've got iconic species, you've got graphic images being shown, people going out on a tourism boat and, you know, seeing animals being essentially dead in the water. And people start to question the sustainability in the products they eat and why they choose them.
Mate, if you can for me, I've seen it reported or seen in the paper recently in the last sort of 3 or 4 weeks that potentially the larger barramundi bounce off the nets. Are you qualified to make a comment on that?
To a degree. So gill nets typically, they're shaped at a certain size and they're selective in terms of the size of the fish getting caught around the gills, hence the name. So generally speaking, you know, you have an ideal mesh size that catches an ideal fish at a certain age or size class, and the really, really small ones go through, and the big mature ones, in theory, bounce off. But again, you're looking at nets that hang in the water where you've got turtles, dolphins, dugongs, sawfish, and sawfish, it doesn't matter what size the mesh is, they're going to get caught and entangled. So whilst you might be able to select for size in a given fish that you're targeting, there's a lot of collateral damage, to say the least, if it's not done really, really carefully.
And last question for you, mate. Is there anything, again, right between the eyes, is there anything the Northern Territory, is there anything that is on the radar that we, I guess, from a species that is close to being endangered? Are we okay up here? Have we got work to do? Is there anything that...
There is work to do. But I suppose for just to put it in context, you know, everyone in the room knows that the Territory is the barra capital of the world, but what people might not know is that it is the part of the last place on Earth where sawfish, one of the world's most endangered forms of marine fish, have still relatively healthy numbers. And if there's any chance they're going to bounce back anywhere in the world, it's literally in the Territory. And you're talking about an animal that's existed all over the tropics across the world. You know, I've been fortunate enough to be out in the Daly River, and, you know, to see a critically endangered freshwater sawfish is something I'll never, ever forget, let alone every other piece of wildlife. So the Territory is one of the last, well, you know, one of the largest relatively intact tropical coastlines in the world. It is literally a lifeboat for some of the world's most endangered species. And so the Territory has this opportunity right before it now to really make the decisions to keep top end coast super, super healthy. And when we look at the species that are really, really in trouble, we're looking at sawfish. And this is with the barra fishery in particular. Sawfish are at very high risk. Marine mammals like dolphins, dugongs, turtles. The leatherback marine turtle is essentially extinct in Territory waters. So this fishery is a major source of impact for these coastal animals, let alone the significance some of these animals have for cultural and spiritual practices.
One last thing, mate. And have you got one last question? Any advice for us? You're sitting in the chair, you're in Sydney, you're looking at us. You've got a group of passionate people that want to get this right from all sectors, right between the eyes, mate. What's the advice you could give us?
There are some really clear solutions for this fishery that can really put it in a good place. At the moment, I'm not confident that it has a future in its current form, but again, there is the opportunity to do things right. And that would include an immediate buyback of the gillnet licenses to address that displaced effort. So where you're seeing that increased fishing pressure at nearly a decade high in areas like the Roper and the Daly, they're critical habitats for sawfish and speartooth. And particularly areas like the Roper, you've got what's an important marine mammal area that's internationally recognised. And it's here where there's about 60% of the NT's dugong population. So protecting those critical areas from gillnet fishing pressure. Long-term, phase out gill netting in the fishery over the next 3 years. Look at other fishing gears, whether they be traditional methods used by traditional owners, whether it be line fishing, and even, believe it or not, traditional gill netting that can be really, really carefully managed, where you've essentially got your eyes on the water at all time, and if a threatened species comes past, you could basically literally stop your fishing. And the other really big thing is significantly improved consultation across the board. Unfortunately, with respect to the threatened species strategy of this fishery, public consultation wasn't given across the board. But what's great is that we're all here now. We're all having our say. So express those viewpoints to the government and really show them what healthy territory waters mean to you, and what a great future looks like.